Good afternoon, everyone. We're just letting folks get connected to audio, so just bear with us for one moment. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone today. Happy Friday. We are in an exciting time. The I Am Chaffey Community Discussions is very timely as we near our 2020 election. We are very, very privileged and fortunate to have Kenyon Callahan, our professor of political science, with us today as our primary speaker, talking to us about voting and really what suppression of voting means and why your vote is your voice. I'm very happy to have him here with us today to talk a little bit about this and to answer questions. Both Janeth Rodriguez and myself will be looking at the chat if you want to ask a question while he's talking, but we also will have time at the end of the discussion for questions and answers as well. So Professor Callahan, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia and Janeth. I really want to thank you both for sending me this invitation. It was kind of funny the way I got it, but but I really appreciate this. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to my colleagues and people in the community, our scholars who are who we call students. And I'll tell you why I don't like calling them students in a little bit. But it's we're in an inflection point in our society, and it's so important that we take this time to realize, especially what are we, like 4 days out from an election? So we're about 4 days out from an election. And so before I begin, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself. I've been at Chaffey on and off for over 20 years. I was first a student, then I was a student worker where I worked with one of our, where I was an instructional assistant for an amazing sociology and human sexuality professor, Lynn McCloskey, who's no longer with us at the college. In this role, then I became student body president. And so after I became student body president, I was in a position of seeing how Chaffey works. Dr. Kane, who was our previous superintendent president, she took me under her wing and really taught me a lot about politics. I've always been interested in politics, but she really showed me the ins and outs of Chaffey and also the real world, where politics is where most people tend to think politics is not of any importance to their own personal lives. But as we see now in this day and age, politics is very important. When I ended up in this position as an adjunct professor here at Chaffey, I really struggled with the imposter syndrome. And I know a lot of that has to do with what society has told me as a Black man, and about being in these type of spaces. And so my mentor, my friend, my colleague, Dr. Donna Calandras, told me that I did belong in this space, and that, generational trauma has told me many things, and how I need to not allow that trauma to tell me where I don't belong. She told me I need to take ownership of who I am. And I am a political scientist. This is what I do by trade. I shouldn't discount my abilities in this space or any space that I find myself in. And that's what she told me. That really spoke to me and my heart. So before I begin, I kind of want to talk about my time at Chaffey. I was a Chaffey College graduate. As I told you, I was student body president. I was a single father who was carrying a baby in a carrier with a backpack and a diaper bag. And I had some amazing instructors like Donna Calandras, like I said before, Monica Carter, Monica Molina, Eva Rose, and Joanna Jones. I mean, the list goes on, Julie LeMay. I mean, the list goes on. And they let me bring my kid to class. And I don't think we do that much these days, but they really did. They taught me a lot about community, about family, about pouring into our student population, and having our student population, as I like to call it, our scholar population, realize their worth. Tiffany Coleman told me once that, and this stuck with me. She told me about how we should be purposeful with our words. And I think it's so important that when we're talking to our scholars and when we're talking to anybody in general, but especially our scholarly population. And so people are going to say, why is he saying scholarly instead of students? I'm a firm believer that our students are people who have to go to school. That's your K through 12. Scholars are people who want to be here. They want to learn. They want the knowledge. They want to understand. They want to learn to be critical thinkers. And I believe that is our job. And so I try to be purposeful with my words. And speaking of purpose, Marion Wright Edelman said, service is the very purpose of life. It is the rent we pay for living on the planet. I'm a firm believer that we're called to be servants. And servants in all aspects of our lives. If you're religious, you're a servant in your religious community, your church, your temple. We're a servant in this institution. We are servants no matter where we go and in this life. We should be. We're supposed to be there to help people. So when we go through a door, and I had a great conversation with Alicia Rosas yesterday, and we spoke on how it's important that our student population see women of color at Chaffey College in positions of authority. It's important. It's just the aesthetics of it all. For people who, if they don't see themselves, they don't think they can do it. So if you don't see your grandmother vote, you won't think you can vote. You don't think to vote because my grandma didn't vote, so why should I vote? And so today I'm going to talk to you about voter suppression. I'm getting ready to show you a scene where how voter suppression was once applied to people of color, especially African Americans in the Jim Crow South. So we're going to watch this scene. It's about a minute long, and then I'll see you guys on the other side. Thank you.
You work for Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, ain't that right?
Yes, sir.
Wonder what old Dunn will say when I tell him one of his gals down here stirring a fuss.
I ain't stirring no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote.
Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is?
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
How many county judges in Alabama?
67.
Name them.
I'm a Verizon.
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia. So when we watch this scene, we're watching a woman walk up and try to vote. Well, when I see this scene, I realize I'm a descendant of enslaved Africans, and I am. My ancestors come from North Carolina. I've done Ancestry.com, so I am truly a descendant of slaves, and that is not something that I'm ashamed of. There's no shame in saying I'm a descendant of slaves. I'm proud to be a descendant of slaves. And so there are people like Annie Lee Cooper, who Oprah Winfrey was playing in this scene, who was a civil rights activist in her own right. And it's because of people like Miss Cooper that I'm able to vote. And not just me. And let's be clear, it's not just about me and people who look like me. It's about all of us. See, the one thing about the civil rights bills of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Bill of 64, the Civil Rights Bill of 68, the Voting Rights Bill of 65. These bills, these acts that were enacted were not just for people who look like me. They don't say just Black people. They're really for all people. And so when we're looking at voter suppression in the United States, I tell my students all the time, voter suppression is as American as apple pie. When the forefathers created the Bill of Rights and the Constitution back in the late 1700s, what we saw was, it was one of the first things they did was suppress the vote. And how did they do that, you're asked? Well, I like to do rhetorical questions where I ask myself questions. You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to be a landowner. So that right there excluded a whole lot of early Americans from voting. Before I go any further in this discussion about what voter suppression is, I need to tell you what it is. And according to Britannia.com, it's any legal or extra legal measure, strategy whose purpose or practical effect is to reduce voting, or anyone registering to vote by members of a targeted racial group, political party, or religious community. Let me be clear. A majority of victims of voter suppression in the United States have been African Americans and other communities of color. But we also suppress the vote with college students, and most college students are not Black and they're not brown, they're white. Because some people in power know how young people are going to vote. We also suppress the vote with our elderly population. This is why we ask people for voter IDs. Grandma's 95 years old. She probably hadn't had an ID in 20 years. So when grandma goes, and I'm just saying Mrs. Johnson, when Mrs. Johnson goes down to the, when she heads over to the poll, usually everybody knows who Mrs. Johnson is. She's been there for 95 years. Now this idea of that she has to have an ID. And then we have to ask, can Ms. Johnson get to the DMV to get that ID? So, and then we have to ask, does the Secretary of State of any state put DMVs and IDs? Is there ID, a place to get your ID in a community where it's accessible? And these are questions we got to ask ourselves. We luckily live in California. Look, most of you guys are down, I'm in Ventura right now, so I'm kind of via satellite, but most of you guys are in the Inland Empire. There's a DMV in Rancho Cucamonga. There's one in Fontana. There's one in Riverside. There's one in San Bernardino. We have DMVs, we have access, but in a lot of states, there will be one DMV per county. Now just imagine if you live in San Bernardino and your DMV is in Barstow. Can you just imagine having to drive? And what if you don't have a car? How do you get to the DMV? How do you get a license? And they're not asking for school IDs. This is what we have to be clear on. We have to be very clear on these type of issues. They're saying school IDs, and let's remember, school institutions, college institutions are literally government institutions, and they're saying your ID has to be a government ID. Well, isn't a college institution a government institution? Well, in some states they don't count. So these are ways where we're impeding people's ability to vote. So when we're talking about voter suppression and how we're blocking people from voting, we usually see things from the lens of black and white here in America. And I usually tell my students in the class, we got to take off the blinders from black and white, because it's not always just a black and white. And I'm a firm believer that is done intentionally, because if somebody doesn't look like you, you're less inclined to, people in power think, if somebody doesn't look like you, you're less inclined to care. And so these are very important things to understand. I was telling my class this morning, I asked my students, I said, do you guys know of any police involved shootings? Tell me about the people's name. I had students who were telling me names like Ahmaud Arbery, never forget 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice. Just this, in that case, has just been brought up too. Tamir Rice was murdered back in, I think, 2011, and it's going through the Department of Justice. This stuff matters, everybody. And you're saying, well, why is he talking about this? Because if we don't vote, and this is what I'm seeing in our social media sphere right now, if we don't vote, what's going to happen is you're not going to be at the table. And this is kind of what I said earlier about Alicia Rosas. It's important that, and I told her yesterday, it's important that we see women of color in our positions at Chaffey, because if we don't see those women in the room, young women of color will feel like they're not valued enough and they don't belong in those rooms. So it's always important to have people like Alicia Rosas, in position in those rooms. And so it's important, because especially young people feel like their vote doesn't matter, but your vote does matter. We tend to conflate things in our election. We conflate the idea that the president of the United States and the vice president, because they're elected through the electoral college and the popular vote. And so people tend to think every other office that's running goes through the electoral college. That is not true. It is just the president and vice president. And we live in a country that is based on checks and balances and shared governance. It is a shared governance type of system. And so, and how do we do that? We do that on a federal level where we have checks and balances. Okay, on a state level with the federal government, there's things that the federal government can't do that the states do. That's a shared governance type of a system of government we have in place. And so, and it goes even further than that. We have it on a local level with your county and your municipal, but even goes further. Your school boards also have a certain amount of authority, your water districts. So these things are very important that we're involved. Your vote matters, your vote counts. And so before I go any further, and I'm going to get back to what I told my students, but I want to kind of, and when I talk, I go into a circle and I come back and I'm like, oh, that's what he was going. So I tend to take everything on a little bit of a ride. So just enjoy the ride that we're going to be on for the next about 15, 20 minutes. And then I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. But one thing I do want to say is, before we talk about voter suppression in 2020, we got to talk about voter suppression after the Civil War. After the Civil War, after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln as president, was from the South. He was his wife's family, his family were slave owners, but those border states stayed in the Union. Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached. The radical Republicans tried to impeach him because he was doing a lot of things that were hindering the Black population, the newly freed enslaved Africans, to be able to function in the society in America. So when we talk about voter suppressions against African Americans, because this is where the crux of it lies. African Americans tend to, by and large, vote one political party over another. And before I go any further, I always want to be intentional and deliberate. And so people know my agenda. I'm not here to push an agenda of any political party. How you vote is how you vote, but I will bring facts and data to the table. Now, what you do with that is your decision. I'm not here to argue with anybody and try to get people to vote the way I vote. You will never know how I vote. You will never know what I believe on our propositions, and which are just as important as you voting for a president, is you voting for your propositions and your local laws that your local government wants to enact, because all politics is local, believe me, and that's definitely true. But in 1877, when the former enslaved Africans in the former Confederate States were briefly allowed to exercise their newly won rights to vote, they ran on local, statewide, and federal levels. They served on juries. And let me be clear, it was not Black women, it was Black men. We tend to disregard women in our society. And I want to do before I go any further with that, let's talk about that real fast. Women are not valued in our society. African-American women are the least valued in our society, but women as a whole are not valued in our society. We do not value women. And so when I'm talking a lot about this stuff, I'm not talking about women. Women did not have the right. Women, we got to remember, women couldn't get a credit card without their husband's permission until after the 1970s. So around the 80s is when women were allowed to even get their own credit card in America. We got to remember this. We got to remember women. So when I'm talking about Black men, not women. When I'm talking about the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was proposed in 1866 and it was ratified in 1868. And it addressed the issue of citizenship, while the 15th Amendment, which was proposed in 1869 and ratified in 1870, dealt with the issue of the rights of the citizens based on their race, color, and previous condition of servitude. And that's important to understand. Okay, and those amendments, along with the 13th Amendment, I know everybody know if you watch the Netflix documentary, The 13, that's what that is about. Those are called the Reconstruction Amendments. The idea of these amendments were to guarantee citizenship, equal civil and legal rights to African American men. Again, let's remember that. Specifically let us come to this place in America where Black men and white men were, based on the law, were starting to be viewed as equal. This wasn't good for white people in the South. White people didn't like this. And this is where you get organizations, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. who would try to disrupt during the time of Reconstruction these newly and freed Africans, enslaved Africans who are now Americans from voting. They would lynch them. They would just burn down their houses. Well, what ends up happening is the federal government sends troops into the South, and they literally police the South to protect polling places, to put down white supremacist violence and riots. Due to these protections, Black voters elected hundreds of state representatives and 16 Black U.S. representatives and senators to Congress. Now we know that this doesn't last long, because we go through almost 100 years of Jim Crow. But during this time, when Black men were in those positions, you start seeing Black people, and what really does happen, because you see that you can go into the South, you'll see Black families that have wealth, and because it goes back to that time and a little time after. Okay, so I want to make sure we understand that we can't paint a broad brush of people in those communities, but at the same time, Black men were rising in rank. They were in the halls of justice, and the Klan and those who belonged to those white citizen groups didn't like it, and so they started lynching and doing the things to try to disrupt. They would have picnics. And I was doing research into picnics a little while ago, and because somebody had told me picnics mean, my grandma used to tell me picnics had a negative connotation. This is why Black people say cookouts, because picnics, even though historically was started in France, it was a French thing. In America in the 19th and the 20th centuries, these were settings for lynching of Black people. According to the Equal Justice Initiative entitled Lynching in America, notes that during the late 1800s and early 1900s, white men, women, and children would be present at these picnics and watch these horrific murders while enjoying deviled eggs, sandwiches, lemonade, whiskey, and in a picnic-like atmosphere. They were celebrating the death of people because it was because of things like these people wanted to vote. This was disruptive. So you scare these people, you terrorize these. This is terrorism. Something our government doesn't call white nationalist group terrorist groups, domestic terrorists. And there's a reason for that too. But these are terrorist groups. Now, picnic doesn't originate with the idea of Black people being hung, but it was co-opted in America in Jim Crow's South and during Reconstruction as a way to terrorize Black people, to get them afraid of voting and thinking they're equal to white people. The Reconstruction doesn't last long because, like most things in America, Americans, we don't pay attention to things for long periods of time. Remember kids in cages? Well, you know what? They're still sending some cages. They're still trying to find kids to get home to their parents. But we don't know that because we don't pay attention to that stuff anymore. But by the time of the end of the Civil War ended in 1865 and the 1870s, white Northerners had grown tired of federal intervention in the South. It was boring, how you keep people in chains for over 100 and something years, and less than 15, you think, okay, everybody should be good, but that's not always true, right? You can't change 400 years of one way of thinking in a matter of just 15 years. It just doesn't happen that way. So in a disputed election in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was anti-slavery, struck a deal with the other side. And like I said, I'm being careful about using political parties, but at the time it was the Democrats. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican. The Republicans, and this is where we hear a lot of Republicans say we're the party of Lincoln, and some people say, well, not anymore. Well, during those days, they were the party that wanted Black people to be free. And the radical Republicans, who were from the North, wanted Black people to be free. Well, there was a contested election, and this is why this is important. It had to, it wasn't even about a popular vote, it was about the Electoral College. So Rutherford B. Hayes struck a deal with Southern politicians. If you vote for me, give me the Electoral College, and make me president, I will remove troops from the South. Well, once he did that, you have the removal of those troops. Those troops now are gone. Black people are no longer protected. Jim Crow comes into play. Jim Crow oppresses the Black vote. Black people are no longer slaves, are enslaved people anymore. The enslavement of Black people is gone. But we find other ways to tie people, and we see this all the time. We see it now. You see it in 2020, not with Black people, but people in coal country. You tie people to the land, sharecroppers, give them very little, so they make just enough to survive, so they can never leave, and so they're stuck. And we see this in 2020 again. Go to West Virginia, go to coal country. This is why those people in coal country are pushing back against technology. We call those people Luddites. Luddites are people who don't want technology. And when we're dealing with this type of mentality, because technology progress is going to happen. It's just, are you on board with progress? And so it's going to happen. So when we see this type of behavior happening in the South, in Jim Crow South, you see Black people having their rights taken away. And so for the next 100 years, you have Jim Crow. But it's not just happening to Black people. This is what people don't understand. I was reading an article in Ed Week where this guy, Nicholas Dauphine, he wrote about his own history, his family's history in Texas. And he said, in my household, I had heard stories from other older relatives about the treatment of Mexican Americans in Texas in the 1900s. From what has been relayed to me, it was not much different from that how Black Americans were treated in Mississippi. Though through my parents, I have heard of schools for Mexican children separating drinking fountains, having to sit in the Black balconies at movies, not being able to go to restaurants and other establishments that were designated as whites only. And so let me be clear. I want to also be clear on something else. When we're talking about Mexicans, it's not just Mexicans, just so you know. And that was another thing I had mentioned to my students that day. I mentioned my students the other day. When people say Mexican or Chinese, most people don't know the difference between a Mexican and El Salvadorian, from a Guatemalan to a Honduran. Most Americans don't know the difference between a Chinese, a Korean, to a Japanese, to a Vietnamese. They don't know. So we give people these labels, and then we treat them a certain way. So I share this point to remind all of us that civil rights are not just about Black people's rights. They are put in place for all Americans to enjoy the rights that are afforded to all of us under the Constitution of these United States of America. Plus, we tend to see oppression and institutional and structural discrimination through a Black-white lens, a prism of Black and white. We really do. And what I'm trying to do is educate all of us. Now, I'm not trying to discount the Black experience, not at all. I'm Black, and I can never discount my experience. But at the same time, there's other experiences of people being disenfranchised. And if we allow one group to be disenfranchised, LGBTQ plus community, when does it stop? When does it stop? I mean, so that's why it's important that when we talk about disenfranchisement, the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, the disenfranchisement of our elderly population, because you're trying to disenfranchise people with voter ID. We're prevented from voting on or even registering to vote through intimidation, violence. You have poll taxes, literacy. They would have good character tests. So what's a good character test? You have grandfather clauses. You have all these things in place to stop people from voting. Now, poll taxes were made unconstitutional in the federal elections, and in the federal elections brought in the 24th Amendment of the Constitution back in 1964. The practice of applying literacy tests to Black voters only was banned by the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Literacy tests in general were suspended in certain jurisdictions by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court had already struck down the grandfather clause in 1915. Okay, They had white-only primaries, which became outlawed in 1945. But let's be clear, and I want to be clear on this. The stuff in 1915, the stuff that was done in 1944, if you had a federal government that wasn't willing to enforce it, it was still done. It was still done. Remember Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. There was still segregation of schools, even though the Supreme Court had ruled. It took people to fight those districts. It takes us to fight for our rights. And I know a lot of people, I know there's people who say, I don't have time. But if you can wait in line for a Starbucks, if you can wait in line to get into Disneyland, you can wait in line to vote. You know, it's very important. And again, I'm not pushing one side or the other. I already voted, but I am telling you, your vote matters. It is so important that we realize that if we don't stand in these long lines, because right now the Supreme Court is already rolling back laws. In fact, if we talk about the voting right, just in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled Shelby v. Holder. Shelby County was a county is a county in Texas. And in Shelby, they sued Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General of the United States. They argued that the Voting Rights Act, Section 4 they didn't need it anymore, that it was unconstitutional. And what Section 4 talks about, basically talks about how certain places in the South in order for them to change their voting laws, had to go through the Department of Justice. Well, those places in the South said, hey, we're now equal. Everybody's equal. Everything is fair now. Well, in Holder, the Supreme Court ruled inside of Shelby County. Not only did they struck down Section 4B, but Section 4B was a pre-clearance for Section 5, which ended up making Section 5 weak. And what Section 5 give jurisdiction to the Department of Justice over these jurisdictions. Well, that no longer exists. What happens that night? And I kid you guys not, literally that night. Literally what happens that night, you had states, I believe it was like 11 states. Now remember, there was 10 in the Confederacy. You had 11 states that night start passing restrictive, draconian voter ID laws. And again, we got to remember, DMV in some states are not DMV in some states are not like our DMVs. There's some DMVs in some states that are literally just for driving, not registration, not any of that, just for, you go get a license there, you go get an ID. Well, again, I go back to what I said previously in the beginning of this discussion. Do we, as a people, do we allow our government to put a single DMV, and I'm using San Bernardino as a good example, because San Bernardino is a county that's larger than Rhode Island. So if we put the DMV again in Barstow, how many of us are going to be able to go out there and get our ID? And that's the closest one, because what they'll do is put the one in LA County up near almost to Ventura. So either way, you're driving. Or they will say, if you live in the county, you have to go to the DMV in that county. And if you don't, again, and it's an issue of access. People will do things to stop people from voting. Long lines, we're seeing that this week. We're seeing this concept of these long lines. You have counties in Texas that have seen a 44% close rate of polling places, but have seen their populations grow by 15, 20,000 people. Waco, Texas is a good example of that. What they did in Waco was they closed 44% of the polling places. And when they did that, they did it directly in Latino or Latinx communities. That's who they were targeting. They have used as the federal judge in North Carolina, when they started trying to pass these voter suppression laws, and I call them voting suppression laws. What they've done, and what they've done is the judge said they use surgical precision. They were very meticulous, and luckily that judge struck it down, and it went to the appellate court, and the appellate court sided with the state, because the governor of that state at the time was trying to pass a draconian law, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme. I'm sorry, no. Let me rephrase that. Let me go back. The federal court said no, it got appealed. The appeal court agreed with the federal court. When it got to the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it because the Supreme Court said the appellate court was right. Actually, the federal court was right when saying using surgical precision to stop people from voting. In 2012, in that same county where Waco sits in Texas, they had one polling place for 4,000 people. By 2018, they had one polling place for 7,700, so almost double. It is so important that we understand that when we're talking about these voter suppression laws, we're talking about these laws that are put in place to hinder us as people. And I'm not just talking about, again, it's not just Black people, it's not just brown people. You see, this is being done to college students. This is being done not just to college students, but this is also being done to our older population. These are some states where voter suppression legislation by state, where a bill is signed into law. So you have like Alabama, Kansas, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas. You see Texas? Always Texas. Wisconsin. And then you have where it's advancing. Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Mississippi, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, even in California, the legislation failed. Luckily, we stopped it because we should not be hindering anybody's right to vote. Colleagues, friends, scholars, students, community members. Everybody should have a right to vote. If you're legally able to vote, people should have a right to vote. This is not just, these types of tactics are just done for those people, but we also have a prison population. And this is where the 13th Amendment, remember that I said those 3 Reconstruction Amendments? The 13th Amendment can be viewed as a double-edged sword. This amendment that abolished slavery, but it doesn't just stop there. If you read the actual text, and let me read the text. In section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place subject to their jurisdiction. Look, and then in section 2 of this, because there was 2 sections to this amendment, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So now let's take a little trip, okay? First of all, let's talk about section 1. In section 1, if you're a criminal, then they have a right to take away your right to vote. If you're a felon, if you've been convicted of a felony, they have a right to take that away. Now, if we look at our prison population, people, and I hear people always say, I hear people say, well, Black and brown people tend to commit crimes. That's not true. That's not true. Data has shown, and there has been data done by different institutions. There was a judge in San Diego back in the early 2000s who had to let a lot of people of color out because what he saw was a judge down in San Diego County who was letting white criminals off because they look like his son. Remember what I said about aesthetics, how important that is? When people see things, beauty to the eye, people see people who look like them, they tend to, oh, that looks like my son. Oh, that's like my kid. And when you're in a courtroom, a judge has a lot more leeway than we think they have. So these are very important. This is very important to know this stuff. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Remember the crime bill? And I'm not gonna spend too much time on the crime bill and attacking one politician over another about that because there was a whole lot of people who signed on that crime bill, even Black politicians, because people were tired of the violence in the inner cities. If you go back to NWA and all those rap groups back in the 80s, they were telling their stories. And these are true stories of things going on in inner cities. Okay, impeding the ability to vote after someone has served their time is everything that this country is against, and I'm a firm believer in that. The whole goal of going to prison, at least that's what we were always told, it was to rehabilitate and let people back out. And in the 13th, that documentary I was talking about earlier, Kevin Gannon, a professor of history at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa, he said, if you have embedded that into the structure in this constitutional languages, then it's there to be used as a tool for whatever purpose one wants to use it. So we have to ask the question, what's the purpose of why people were trying to use that, was trying to use that amendment to imprison people, and that wording was done intentional. It was very intentional. I don't think when they passed the crime bill and when all those people would I don't think when they passed the crime bill, a lot of those people, I don't think they knew. And one of the candidates who's running for president said at the time when they passed it, he really didn't realize the effects it would have on communities of color. He said the thought was to curb crime. He didn't know, and this is what we have to realize. Police unions have a lot of power. And I will leave it at that. A lot of power. We need to rethink that structure. We talk about teachers unions, we talk about grocery unions, we talk about all these unions, but we never talk about the police union and the power that they have. And this is why when certain people in communities of color are murdered, they tend to get away with it because it's due to the power of the police union. But let me show you guys the midterm elections and just give you a little info, just let you see this model of if you look at Georgia is a good example. Ineligible to vote because of felony. Look at that. Oops, sorry. And then you have a margin of victory, right? Right here, the margin of victory. If these people could have voted, if you look at Florida, you look at North Carolina, in some of these states, if felons, and I'm not talking people who've done gruesome murders, I'm not talking about that. Please be clear, because we always tend to like to take things to extremes on either side. I'm talking about people who served their time. They did 5 years for having drugs. They should be able to have their right to vote, and nobody should be against that. If they serve their time, now they should be free to be able to exercise that right. None of us should be able to, and we should not be for the impediment of people's rights. So, and we have many, and I can go on all day about voter suppression. I can go on all day how voter suppression is used to keep communities of color down. I earlier talked about Tamir Rice, and I brought up those names, but one thing I wanted to talk about in California, and I don't think a lot of us know this, but in the state of California, in our state of California, we've had there are 3 murders I don't think people knew about. And these were not Black people. And I was kind of touching on that earlier. I don't think many people heard of Andres Grudado, who was 18 years old and killed by LA County sheriffs. Sean Monterosa, who was 22-year-old young man, who was killed by law enforcement, also here in California. When I was reading his story, I was reading on it this morning and I didn't get the city. But also there was Eric Salago, who was murdered along with his unborn child, but his pregnant girlfriend survived. Again, this is why it's important for communities of color, important for elderly people are involved, they do get involved. But it's important for college students of all colors to be involved in the voting process. There's voter suppression going on in this country today, right now, this week. And I can tell you about some in Pennsylvania. The state's highest court has ruled that the election officials should count mail ballots that arrived up to 3 days after the election. One political party was trying to reverse that order. And you can look it up, because like I said, I'm gonna keep political parties out because I don't want nobody saying he has an agenda. You can look it up, because Google's a great resource. It'll tell you exactly who's doing it. Also in North Carolina, one campaign has asked the Supreme Court to block the state's Board of Elections from extending the deadline to receive mail ballots. So if you mail in your ballot and it shows up after the election, whose fault is that? And I want to be clear. The current, and I'm going to say this because this needs to be said. The Trump administration put a postmaster general in charge of the post office, and he went in with surgical precision to disrupt the mailing process. The post office was not so, this post office is not perfect, but I know I can mail something here from Ventura to my cousin's house in Temecula, Paris, and it'll get there probably, if I mail it on Monday, it'll get there by Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, if I mail it on Monday, it might not get there till Friday. That's not our fault. The administration put a man in charge of it, and he literally disrupted. And this was in the news. Okay, just on Monday, the Supreme Court of the United States sided with the Republican officials in Wisconsin, ruling ballots must be in by 8 p.m. on election day to be counted. You know, so I mean, these things, you got Nevada. You got one campaign suit to stop the counting of absentee ballots in the Las Vegas area. Why Las Vegas? Why not for the whole city? Texas, always Texas. It's always Texas. The state's top court yesterday upheld a policy and announced that Greg Abbott, who's the governor of the state, which limits each county to a single drop-off box for mailed ballots. You know how big Texas is? So for Harris County, which includes Houston, it has 4.7 million people. There's one drop-off box. This is voter suppression, everybody, and I need you guys to understand that. This is voter suppression. Okay, there's a judge in Michigan who overturned the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, and ruled that people can carry concealed guns to a polling place. These are things that we need to be aware of. These are things that we need to know what's going on. We are in a time, and that I feel like we're living in a time that my grandmother lived in, and this should not be the case. These are battles my grandmother fought, and I'm getting ready to wrap it up. I'm gonna wrap it up with this real fast, and I wanna end it with this so you guys understand how voter suppression works. And so this is what happens in voter before voting. Registering to vote is the first required step for a citizen to make in order to vote by mail or in person during early voting or on election day. When voter registrations are processed late, requested mail-in ballots are not mailed properly, particularly in selected areas over others. That's one way to do voter suppression. Okay, then you have during voting, citizens must be able to access ballot, whether in person or by mail. These acts can be thwarted by consolidation of precincts, making polling locations hard to reach, rejecting mail-in ballots without providing time to correct them issued by mail, polling locations running out of provisional backup paper ballots, and exceeding long wait times. So again, if you have one polling place and you got 5,000 people and it's almost 8 o'clock and the poll place is closing, what happens? You might not be able to vote. They might not count it. According to some of those states, counting ballots reliable is critical. These counts are certified by the Secretary of State, validating candidates' wins or losses. When there is a failure to count properly, cast votes to provide correct, timely provisional ballots statuses, trust accuracy in the electoral system erodes. And then that's also something that stops people from voting. So then we end up being discouraged. And I want to say today, and and I know I gave a lot of information, don't be discouraged. We stand on the shoulders of people like Cesar Chavez. We stand on the shoulders of Rosa Parks, Dr. King. We stand on the shoulders of people who are ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Dolores Huerta. I mean, we stand on show. So all I say today is, I don't care what political party you're voting for. I'm telling you, we need to vote. Your vote matters. And because your vote matters, then when you vote, you will be at the table. If you're not at the table, you'll see somebody who looks just like you, like Alicia Rosas. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, feel free. I will take your questions. You're on your speaker.
I was just saying, I feel like I'm taking one big inhale, exhale over the information you presented to us today in a way that was, one, intriguing to follow. All the history and all the years that you shared with us today in a few, handful of minutes. Incredible. You know,
Yeah.
I personally always appreciate your support, and I thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
always for that. I'm hoping that we can open it up to some questions or thoughts. I mean, is there anyone on the Zoom today that's wondering or just want to share that they learned something new that they didn't understand or that they may have a follow-up question on? You know, I think this is a great opportunity for discussion, as we are fewer than 100 hours away from
Yeah.
incredibly important election in all of our lives.
In our lifetime.
Absolutely.
Had a hand raised, and I think it was Dana iPhone. Donna.
Yeah, that's my cousin.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but
okay.
but voter suppression, though, you know what? I thank you for explaining that, because I understood a little, but now I really get it. So now it's like, go out there and let people know about voter suppression and vote.
And like I said, for for the sake of transparency, that's my cousin. It's weird because we really don't talk a lot about politics. We really don't. So I feel bad because I'm like, she doesn't know what's her problem. She's like, I'm not doing my job.
You're fired.
We are proud of you.
Oh, thank you, Shirley. That's my aunt. Thank you, Auntie Shirley.
He's live. Look, there. Oh.
That is my nephew.
Well, thank you.
Had Beverly raised her hand.
Oh, hey, Bev. You gotta get off mute, Beverly. Yeah, I think she's still on mute.
All right, I can't find her. Can we unmute her, Jeanette?
I'm asking her.
I got it. I got it. Okay, it's not Beverly. I don't know why her name and her picture came up.
Oh, hey, Ola.
It's over. I really enjoyed that. It was well-rounded. You touched on a lot of different areas that I didn't even know about, and it's just, you know, it was just really, really good. So thank you. Thank you for the information.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you coming. Ola cuts my hair.
Not
Look,
today, I didn't.
I'm doing transparency. I don't want people thinking I'm dropping little people in and asking questions like I'm a politician.
We also have Dr. Donna Calandres wrote in the chat, thank you, Professor Callahan. We honor your presence and knowledge.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Calandres. You missed the part where because again, I wouldn't be here today, and I want to be very honest and be very frank. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for people like Dr. Calandres. And I named them. I said Monica Carter, Eva Rose, Monica Molina. I would not be here because I'm telling you, when I was a student at Chaffey, I wanted to walk out on so many days, and these people encouraged me. I did. It was like every other Tuesday I was threatening to drop out of school. And I can go into any of those offices, and they just really pushed me to be the best me I can be. So thank you. I have somebody, VNA, she's one of my students. You're in private. Can you, go ahead, you can ask a question, but can you put it in, can you take it out of private for me? Do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So one of the points you made kind of stood out to me, and I have a couple questions about it. So you mentioned how you think that like ex-felons deserve the right to vote.
Yes.
And when I was going over the propositions, that one kind of like had me, I don't know, I guess I didn't know what to put. So I think like I appreciate hearing about that.
Yeah.
But also, like, you bring up the point, like, a lot of people do automatically jump to, like, the extremities.
Yeah.
So is there...
We got to remember, most people are in prison for drug possession, you know, and now there's drugs we have that are legal. And so people went to jail in 1999 for having some marijuana in their pocket, and they're in prison 20 years later. And these are true cases. because they were in the 3 strikes law, because they got caught in 2 other times with drugs. So we have to be aware of that and not sit there and think that somebody who's molested 50 kids, because if the guy who molested 50 kids is not going to get out of prison, he's going to be there for the rest of his life. So I'm not arguing people in prison should have the right to vote. I'm arguing that when they get out, when they're done serving their time, they should have that right. They serve their time. We don't know a lot of people, and you're one of my students. We don't know a lot of people's experiences. We don't know why the guy went into the store and stole bacon, because he might have 5 kids at home he's trying to feed. And if he doesn't have a job, that people do desperate things in desperate times, especially now. Those are those desperate times. So I appreciate you showing up, and you got extra credit because you came in here today.
Thank you. Yeah, so like
You will never get this. You will never get this.
I will follow up with that in an email. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No problem. I'll see you next week in class.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
That person has been removed, so just so you know.
Okay. I don't even know who that was.
I don't know either, but I removed them. I know I think Heather, you have your hand raised?
I just wanted to thank you. This was an incredible presentation, and I'm watching as a Chaffey staff member today, but as a mother of a middle school child, being able to have this information presented to her in a way that will put all of history together in a short period of time is really important. And I think I would encourage you to share this message in multiple avenues, because I think people don't understand how we've got here and what we can do to change it. So I really appreciate that as a parent. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Heather. And you have a daughter. So I think it's important that we always give that perspective, especially from women, because a lot of time in history, we don't talk about women. And when we talk about equality and people getting rights, I make sure I always stress that we're not talking about women. And because women need to realize that the struggle really isn't over for them. It really is not. We live in such a misogynistic society, and we do not like our women. So yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that with your daughter. I think it's important. We got to be honest about who we are as a nation, and men have to be better allies and accomplices to women and women's rights.
I have a comment. I don't know if this is voter suppression, but in Rialto, I dropped off my voter ballot, and that voter where you're able to drop it off is 24/7. You can drop it off anytime. I'm in a different location right now, and you can only drop that voter envelope off between 10 and 4 Monday through Friday.
Really?
So I don't know if it would be considered voter suppression, but I thought, wait a minute.
Well, my question to you on that box, because so our current attorney, our current Secretary of State is Alex Padilla, and Alex Padilla has put those boxes. So you got to be careful, because there is a political party that's not in power in California that has set up ballot boxes that are not sanctioned by Alex Padilla's office. So any ballot box. So usually ballot boxes that are done through his office are 24 hours. I would check that ballot box and make sure his name is certified by his office. If it's not, don't do it. Don't drop it off, because there have been fake voter, and what they're doing is saying, oh, but we'll take that over and have that and turn those in. No, I'm gonna give it to Alex Padilla. I want Alex Padilla to get it directly. I want his office or somebody through the county clerk's office, not some political party. That's a problem.
Thank you.
Oh, Ray has a question. What's your question, Ray? Ray Austin. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said amazing. Okay.
There was a question in the chat box, and they said, can we hear a little bit about the importance of midterm voting?
Midterm, yes.
Presidential races.
Okay, yes, midterm is always important. The great thing about midterm voting, well, 2018 was historical. Nancy Pelosi ends up back as Speaker of the House. She's one of 4 people to ever be returned to that speaker position. The speaker position is a very powerful position. So understand, our country is not run by a dictator. It's a shared, it's checks and balances. And so the speaker has a lot of power. Those races are so important because if a party that you don't want to be in power, that's usually how the power dynamic shifts are through midterm elections. Because a lot of time people don't vote. And especially a lot of young people in those midterm years, people only want, it seems like we only want those presidential years, but midterm is so important because midterms will let you know how many members of Congress you have. Midterms will let you know, in LA City, you have your mayoral races during those midterms. A lot of your cities have elections. A lot of your cities pass bond measures that you don't even know about because it's a midterm and nobody's paying attention. Midterms are just as important as presidential elections, period. There's no any which way around it. It's just as important. Again, especially on more local level, that's when things get by you and you're like, how come I'm paying extra this on my taxes for the city? Well, because you didn't vote. I mean, because they just had an election and you didn't realize they passed a bond measure that affected your taxes. So that's usually when a lot of the good stuff gets slid by you because we're not paying attention. So you should pay attention to every election that comes your way. Every election, you should be paying attention. Hope I answered their question.
I'm sure you did. Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Professor Callahan?
Cynthia Mendoza raised her hand.
Hi, Cynthia.
No, there we go. You have to unmute her or him, Janessa. I can't.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I did it as she did it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. I just want to say thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was very informative. My question is, other than voting, what other actions could we as a community take to fight voter suppression?
Well, you can also get involved with your local politicians. You can have your politicians do town halls and ask them where they stand on the issues. Not just, you can join other stakeholders, usually communities, and usually a lot of times you'll have stakeholders. And what stakeholders are people who have a vested interest in the same issue that you do. And that way you don't feel like you're doing all the work, but get involved with organizations. If you're an elderly person, get involved with the AARP. If you're a younger person, they have lots of different organizations. I don't want to name some because I know somebody will think I'm taking sides. But there's a lot of organizations out there for you to join that are fighting against voter suppression. The one I would say, NAACP are the NAACP tends to do a lot of fighting against voter suppression because it has impacted the African American community. But like I said in the presentation, not just Black people, we got to be clear, not just Black people, not just brown people, we have to be clear. And so what we all have to be aware of is we don't wait till something happens to me for me to be involved. When I saw kids in cages, that was a problem. I don't care who was president. To me, it wasn't that was not a political issue. That was a humanitarian issue. And we should have been ashamed of ourselves as Americans when we saw little kids in a cage. And so it's important that we do something. I got involved. There's ways to get involved. There's ways to contact groups. And so I think it's very important that you find out in your community who's trying to stop voter suppression. And be clear, in California, we don't have voter suppression. There's no voter suppression in California. Alex Padilla has made voting so easy. You go down to the DMV, you get a license, you register to vote. I mean, that's it in California. So it's not really us, it's other states, but there's organizations in those states that are fighting against voter suppression. So you can donate $10. And I know a lot of us say we don't have a lot of money, but I just tell people, don't go to Starbucks for one day. Make your coffee at home and send that. That's $5. I mean, and if everybody can send $5, then that will help advancement of people in Texas. That'll help the advancement of people in Mississippi and in Florida and in North Carolina. I mean, it does. It really does. Because let me be clear about something else. Just because your governor's a Democrat doesn't mean they're not, because you have to look at your state houses. And if your state house is of a political party that's pushing voter suppression, then that's what you have to worry about. So this is why off-year elections matter too, because you got to know who's controlling those state houses, because that is where affects your ability to vote, because it's through the Secretary of State of your state, not the Secretary of State of the United States. It's through the Secretary of State of California or of Texas that they control the vote. So it's very, very important that you're aware.
In the chat, Ray Austin made this comment: an awesome job. I believe this is a presentation that should be offered each semester. There are a lot of folks who are fearful of sharing that they don't know how to vote, the importance of voting, and the history of voting. Yes. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think that anytime we don't know necessarily what to do, sometimes we don't want to appear, like we're ignorant or unaware. So I am going to put in the chat a website page on the Chaffey website that we put up for awareness building, frequently asked questions, helpful resources on how students and anyone in our community can get involved with voting, and how to register to vote, links to all of that. So that's also in the chat now for folks to look at it either now or later if they want to.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no. And again, I went onto that site and it was put together very well. And it's just so important, and it's okay to be ignorant. It's willful ignorance. It's not okay to be. If we're ignorant, it means I just don't know. But if I'm willfully ignorant, then that's the problem. And that's where we need to make a change. So, it's okay and we have to be able to, as academics, we have to let people know I'm ignorant on that subject. So look, we live in a day and time, and I'm not here to insult anybody, but we have people of different genders now that are not just in sexualities, not just straight and gay, but there's so much in between. I was ignorant to a lot of it until students started educating me on it. Transgender students, I was ignorant to a lot of that until students started educating me. So only if I sat in class and said, I don't want to hear this, then I'm being willfully ignorant, because these people exist and I need to recognize them and see them as people like you and I. And that's just the most important thing.
Well, I want to personally thank you on behalf of, the Center for Culture and Social Justice, Professor Callahan, on educating all of us. These types of discussions are important. It's important to remember our history and how there are so many instances in which our histories are aligned, that there are not so many differences in some of our paths, and that we need to see that, and that our voices do matter. There are many times people think that, well, my vote doesn't matter anyway, or it's not worth it. I think it's important to know that if you're going to have a say, or like that seat at the table, like you referenced, this is where that begins. And the choice to not vote is basically your permission to let things stay as the status quo. And if you're fine with that, then you do that. But I think that most of our populations have an opinion on how things are shaped and how things run. And this is an opportunity for that to be brought through voice and through action. If I just want to thank you. I think everyone can show you some what is it, little virtual applause. Like, I'm going to put my little hand right there to say virtual applause. I know that it's a different format for us right now, but this has been truly a joy, and we appreciate having you on our campus and the knowledge you bring.
Thank you.
So
Melissa Kenyon, am I saying that?
Yeah, Melissa had one last question.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Callahan. Thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to, if there are any students in here left, if they have any doubts that their voice matters in this election, what would you say to them?
I would tell them that their voice does matter. I would tell them to not listen to other people. And what I mean by other people, Ice Cube, Kanye West. I mean, don't let celebrities tell you how to vote. I'm sorry. Jennifer Aniston either. No, don't let these people tell you how to vote. They have nothing to lose in this election. They have a lifestyle. Ask Ice Cube where he lives. And if things go bad, Ice Cube will not be in America. Ice Cube is going to pack it up and go to Canada, Mexico, wherever else life is good, and you're going to be stuck. So I would say your vote does matter. Stop letting other people see. What we people have to understand is politics is not a zero-sum game. Politics is really about compromise. It's about people coming together and work. It's like a relationship. There we go. It's like you're in a relationship with your significant other. And that's it right there. You have to compromise. If it's all one way, at some point, somebody's going to be unhappy and somebody's going to leave. So you have to sit down. We have to talk. We have to find and I'm not a moderate by a long shot, but one thing I'm seeing is we do need those moderates at the table. We need that rational voice to say, hey, we can't go too far over here. We can't go for, but let's come together. And so it's important for them to know that it's not a zero-sum game. They got to know that politics is like relationships, is literally relationships. It's like multiple relationships. It's not one, it's like a whole lot of relationships. So you got to go and sit down and talk to people and work things out. And that's all I would tell them. But your voice matters. It really does matter. And just think, if you're down to, if there's an election and both candidates had the exact amount of votes and you didn't vote, just imagine if you would have voted, which your vote would have mattered, because one would have won over the other. But you chose to sit it out. And like Alicia said, we can't sit, you cannot sit on a moving train and not do anything and say you're not involved. The train, we're Americans, even if and when I say that, I think even undocumented people who were raised here from the time they were little kids are Americans. And I'm not talking about Americans in a document. We're Americans. And so there's many different ways for us to be involved. If you can't vote, you don't have to vote, but there's things you can do in the meantime to be a part of. So we can't go through this. And I'm a Black person. I see it in Black spaces all the time where Black people say, well, they haven't done nothing for us yet. Well, the thing is, what have you done for us? And that's why I usually turn the table. What have you done for us? You're waiting for other people to do it. And Monica Carter told me this a long time ago. And I know she wasn't the first person that said it, but it's the first time I heard it. Monica Carter told me the first day we were in her class, be the change you want to see. And that has affected me. That was that was powerful to me when I was 19. You stop complaining and be the change you want to see. So we got to be the change we want to see. If you want change, you got to be it. You can stop waiting for other people to do it for you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone for their questions and comments.
Did she stop?
I think she froze.
Okay.
But is there any other questions or comments?
Oh, there she is.
No, sorry, am I back? Okay. I was saying, if you like this type of talk, then take a class with him if you haven't already. This is a wonderful discussion. Yeah. I want to thank everyone for their time today.
She stopped at the same place.
I know, every time. I love it.
Well, I think if no one else has any other questions or comments, I'll go ahead and stop recording and end the session.